Yep, okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for the next session and Tipping Point, Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference Series, virtual Affordable Housing Conference Series this year. The first one, a partnership for Strong Communities, is hosting. I'm Sean Guillot. I'm the policy director with the partnership. We are, over the course of the week, we're having about 30 sessions, really trying to cover the breadth of housing issues facing the state of Connecticut. And if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, you can use the hashtag #TippingPoint2020, and you can follow us at PSC Housing. So right now we're going to get deep into planning. The planning side of housing. And we have a great session where this is embracing the opportunity to plan for affordable homes in Connecticut. And before we turn it over to our presenters, I first like to thank our sponsors. If I can get that slide to move. First, our lead sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Melville Charitable Trust. I also like to thank the Connecticut Department of Housing, Housing Enterprise Inc., and Whittlesley. And this session sponsor, in addition, we'd like to thank Housing Enterprise Inc. again for sponsoring this particular session on affordable housing plans. So now I will introduce Melissa Kaplan-Macey from the Regional Plan Association. And Melissa will talk more about the Affordable Housing Plan Guide and Plan and Process Guidebook that RPA has been working on behalf of the state of Connecticut during the course of this pandemic. And I'm really excited to hear more about the details. So Melissa, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Sean. Excited to be here today to talk to you about the work that RPA has been doing with the Connecticut Department of Housing to create a guidebook. I think a lot of people have heard rumors about it, so excited to be here to talk about it today, to provide guidance to towns on how to create a local affordable housing plan. And also really excited to moderate a discussion with a great group of panelists to talk about the opportunities and challenges of bringing local communities together to plan for affordability. We have Mark Barnhart here, the Community Economic Development Director for the town of Fairfield. We have Jocelyn Ayer with us today. She is also Community and Economic Development Director for the Northwest Hills COG. And we have Beth Cavagna with us, Planning Director for the town of Bethel. And these folks have been among the many people throughout the state who've been working with us and with the Department of Housing on the guidebook. So looking forward to sharing a little bit about what we've been up to and then really getting into a discussion with all of them about what this really means on the ground. So quickly, I'm just going to do a brief introduction for folks who don't know Regional Plan Association and why planning for affordability is important to us at RPA. RPA is a nonprofit research planning and advocacy organization, and we are dedicated to improving the New York metropolitan region's health, economy, environment, sustainability, and quality of life. We're a small staff. You can see our faces up on the screen. We like to say we punch above our weight in terms of shaping planning and policy in the tri-state region. Over the course of our almost 100-year history, we have produced 4 long-range plans for the tri-state region, the first in 1922, each addressing the most pressing issues of its day. Our most recent regional plan, released in 2017, identified the housing affordability crisis in the region as one of the most pressing issues facing us. And just wanted to share, what we think about at RPA when we talk about affordability, that it's really important that we frame the conversation not about housing in isolation, but as affordable homes, as part of complete communities where everyone has access to a high quality of life, things like healthy environment, good schools, good living wages, adequate transportation, safe streets, and of course, an affordable home. I mean, you might think, that's a great idea. It's a nice picture. We'd love to have that here in Connecticut, but the reality is, Connecticut's an expensive place to live. That's the trade-off for the amenities that our state has to offer. But we'd like to offer another narrative, which is it doesn't have to be that way. Connecticut can be a great place to live, and it can also provide options, affordable options for people at all levels of income. And we really think that planning for affordable housing is an important step in changing that narrative of opposition that I'm sure many people on this webinar are very familiar with, and creating a space for productive conversations about affordable housing in communities, getting ahead of that development application that comes to a town and everybody gets very up in arms, having a conversation before that conversation about what affordability really means and what it could look like in your town. So in addition to this being the right thing to do, the economically prudent thing to do, for all the reasons that RPA is excited about planning for affordable housing, there's also a great incentive, I would say, in the state of Connecticut now, where the state has had the foresight, I think, to introduce legislation, to pass legislation 8-30J, which I think folks are probably pretty familiar with now, in 2017 with compliance. So the first affordable housing plans being required in July 2022. And that legislation, is pretty basic. It says that at least once every 5 years, a municipality must prepare or amend an affordable housing plan. It specifies that municipality intends to create a certain, increasing the number of units in the municipality, but it doesn't really go much beyond that. There's a little bit of language you'll see in these bullets about just the mechanics of the process, but not really providing a whole lot of guidance. And so the phone was ringing off the hook at Department of Housing, from what I understand, with people asking questions, saying, okay, great, this legislation exists, we know we need to comply, but how do we do that? What does the process look like? And what is the plan supposed to look like? So we at RPA was very excited to be able to partner with the Department of Housing to come up with a guidebook that answers those questions and really is a resource for towns. It's not a requirement. It's not that towns have to follow the guidebook to create their plan, but it really is intended to be something towns will want to use that'll be useful. And to that end, over the course of this whole COVID period, we launched this project in February, and then everything obviously came to a halt and then picked back up again over the spring and summer. And we really were able to get out virtually to engage with folks across the state to find out what resources and tools people wanted, what people needed. I'm going to give a very brief overview of what you can expect from the guidebook, and then I'm going to turn it right over to our discussion with the panelists. So firstly, how do you do it? The process is as important as the product. Taking the opportunity to build support for affordable housing through the process of creating the plan. So things like leadership, creating an affordable housing committee, that's something I know we'll talk about today, an inclusive planning process, a clear communication strategy. So I'll just share very briefly, what that looks like in a minute. And then the plan itself, what should be in a plan. So the document will have a process piece. It will also have, I wouldn't call it a template so much, but a checklist of the different elements, and then a description and how-tos and guidance on how to actually create the parts of your plan. So a community value statement as a starting point, sort of bridging the community conversation with how you actually get started with the meat of your plan, talking about and looking at the history of affordable housing in your town, how to do a housing needs assessment. Really important, obviously, to understand the needs in your community if you're going to be planning to address those future needs. And so how to do that, looking at your land use and zoning, understanding your housing market, and then how to actually put together those principal goals and actions that will be the meat of your plan that will guide you into the future and implementation. So really quickly, because the focus today, I'm not going to spend a lot of time or actually any time talking about the nuts and bolts of the guidebook. We really want to talk about the community engagement piece and hear from our panelists on that, how you build support for affordable housing in your community. So number one, creating an affordable housing committee. This is something that we heard across the board from all stakeholders that have done this successfully and folks who are sort of just at the beginning of the process, how bringing together local leaders to proactively plan for affordable housing is really, really central because it creates a constituency of advocates for more affordability in your community and provides the support that elected and appointed officials will need down the road when they have to actually make those specific decisions on affordable housing applications. And then the guidebook really gets into the nitty-gritty on all kinds of engagement, in-person engagement. If we can get back to that someday, we want this guidebook obviously to sustain itself beyond sort of our current climate into the future and talks about all, the range of in-person activities. And then also how you do those things virtually. Some things translate better than others, how you adapt to the virtual environment that we are in now. talking about, sort of the mechanics as well, meeting platforms, online facilitation and protocols, just to give folks the full range of tools that we need to engage. We also spend a good amount of time in the guidebook talking about inclusivity, accessibility, equity, how to be sure that your process isn't just reaching the folks who, typically come out to a public meeting, how do you think about things like people who might be interested and maybe there's availability barriers with respect to just hours of the day that people are working, or, people just awareness of these kinds of processes. So we get into a lot of that, trying to make sure that the plan that you're creating is really involving a full range of stakeholders, because I think like anything else, like we see in public hearings, a lot of times against affordable housing applications, it's, the same constituency of people come out, and, in terms of planning process, that can also be the case. So it's just very important, if the plan is going to be meaningful and useful, that you really reach the whole broad range of stakeholders in your community. And we also get into some specific mechanics. There have been a lot of questions when we were out at public meetings talking about the guidebook on how to do it, how to do social media, digital communications, surveys. So the guidebook has some very specific guidance on those tools as well, which we think will be really useful. We hope will be useful. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite the panelists to come back. And we have some questions I'm excited to ask. Get my notes here and have the panelists all introduce themselves. So I think we can just go alphabetically. I noticed when I was preparing, we have A, B, and C. We have Jocelyn Ayer, Mark Barnhart, and Beth Cavagna. So Jocelyn, if you don't mind just going first in just a few minutes, talking about your experience in planning for and executing affordable housing in Northwest Hills, and also specifically in Salisbury, because I know you have specific experience with that town as well.
Sure, thanks, Melissa. So I've been working basically in towns here in Litchfield County as a regional land use planner for the last 12 years. Before that, I actually worked in affordable housing finance. And in my work with the towns over the last 12 years, a lot of work with them around their plans of conservation and development, or our regional plan of conservation and development, which all need to address housing needs in the town and in the region, and how we plan to address those housing needs. I also staff the Northwest Connecticut Regional Housing Council, which is made up of organizations, nonprofit organizations within Northwest Connecticut who are building and maintaining affordable housing in our region. And so again, hearing from them what their successes and challenges have been over the years in regards to really implementing the plans and strategies that are in place in our towns. And as Melissa mentioned, I'm also a volunteer member of my town, the town of Salisbury's Affordable Housing Committee, which is the nonprofit that maintains existing affordable rental units in our town, and also is proposing to build some additional units. And as a volunteer, I assisted the town with the creation of the town of Salisbury's affordable housing plan that it adopted in 2018.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And Mark?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Barnhart. I'm the Director of Community Economic Development for the town of Fairfield. I've been with the town for almost 20 years now in this capacity, and I provide staff support. Among my responsibilities, provide staff support to our volunteer affordable housing committee, which was formed back in the mid 1980s. Developed an affordable housing plan back in the late 1980s, and then most recently updated its affordable housing plan around 2015. So I've worked with that group in doing that. And we produced a series of action steps related to that plan, and we've been implementing those series of action steps in the years since.
Thanks, Mark. And Beth?
I'm Beth Cavagna. Hi, everybody. I, besides working in the planning office for the town of Bethel, I'm also the chairman of the Bethel Housing Authority. Been doing that for about 5 years now. We have about 20 years of working with 830G here in town, and we do have a affordable housing plan contained in our POCD plan. Also, we have numerous regulations and have incorporated them in, we do have a transit-oriented development plan where you'll find some of them there. And we've been working with the statute in the process, like I said, for about 20 years now.
Thanks, Beth. And just, I think probably a lot of folks, most folks on the line probably are familiar with 830G, but for folks who aren't, I just want to mention that 830G is Connecticut's statute related to the creation of affordable housing in towns that don't meet the 10% threshold of affordable housing in their communities. A developer can come in and challenge a denial of an application when there is 30% or more affordable housing proposed. So just so we're all on the same page. And one other sort of jargony piece, the POCD that we planners speak about affectionately all the time is the Plan of Conservation and Development, which is a master plan for the town, usually a 10-year outlook in Connecticut specifically. So I'm going to just jump in and get to a few questions. We'll spend about a half an hour on the questions that we've prepared and then open it up to Q&A from the audience. But as we're speaking, feel free to just enter questions into the chat and we will get to them at the end of the conversation. So I will start off by saying, I know in my presentation, I painted a pretty optimistic picture of how the planning process can be this great opportunity to create support for affordable housing. And, I know that that's true and not true probably in other ways too. So I'm just interested to talk about your experiences with that proactive planning. I know you've all done it in your communities. What's worked, well, what hasn't worked so well. And we can kind of just go around and hear from you on that question. I don't know who wants to jump in first. But I know I'll point to you, Mark, because we've talked extensively about this, and I know it's been very positive, but also mixed in certain ways in Fairfield.
Well, I would just second one of the points made in your slide presentation earlier, which is the process is very important. And it's, every time we go through this planning process and engage the community in that planning process, an opportunity to educate and inform, and obviously build relationships that it would help build support for your objectives. I do think, as you indicated, it's important to have the support and leadership of local elected officials. We've had the benefit of that for many years here in Fairfield, and also have local champions like the Affordable Housing Committee that's taking the lead. While we've done the larger public workshops and there's various tools and techniques to get people thinking about housing in different ways that they can personally relate to, which I think is very helpful. It's also important to meet people where they live. We did a lot of small group sessions, outreach sessions to specific neighborhoods, particularly those that were impacted by set-aside developments under 830G. And those were difficult conversations to have, but at the same time, it was an opportunity to reframe the discussion around how best to achieve our mutual goals and to provide for control over the process at the local level. So if you don't like what is being proposed by an outside developer, it's important for us to take the lead and provide some key direction there, take charge of that process at the local level. And to do things in a way that is sensitive to community character, community goals, and the like. So I think it's important, obviously, to have those conversations. They're not easy to have. You have to obviously be sensitive to the group that you're meeting with and also listen. It's not all about projecting or providing information, but you have to listen to their concerns and share those as well.
Thanks, Mark. And Jocelyn, I'm curious because I know, Salisbury was very proactive, right? The legislation requiring the plan came out in 2017, and then you all, got ahead of it. I mean, it's not required till 2022, but you adopted your plan in 2018. How do you feel about that process? Did it do a lot of the things that you had hoped it would in terms of getting folks together? Sort of what did you learn from that? Where are you now that you have a local affordable housing plan?
So the town of Salisbury did adopt their plan in 2018, two years ago. And I will say that both Again, it's not a silver bullet like nothing else, like anything else. Just because you have a plan, and our plan in Salisbury is very specific about the number of units we want to create, and also specifically where we want them to go on town-owned properties that the town has control over. However, currently, 2 years later, we do have an application right now before the Planning and Zoning Commission to actually construct one of those developments, and there is a lot, it is very contentious. And so I think, just because you get the plan passed doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be smooth sailing from there. But I would say, and again, echoing what Mark has said and what you've said as well, Melissa, is the process that we went through to engage stakeholders in the process of developing that affordable housing plan, and even all of the things that came before it. The town has 2 or 3 other previous studies on the need for affordable housing and what to do about it, even before the plan in 2018. But all of that, engaging those stakeholders, has really built it has built a significant momentum of support for specific projects as they move forward. Because again, I have never been involved in a affordable housing project that hasn't had some opposition to it. And those are the people that come to the planning and zoning public meetings. But the goal in my mind of these housing plan processes is to bring enough folks along and build enough support for the strategies and the specific projects, hopefully, that you want to pursue, that those people will also come to the public hearing and express their support, because that support is critical to making sure that the actual projects end up getting built on the ground, and your plan doesn't just sit on the shelf and is not able to get implemented.
And have you seen that in Salisbury, Jocelyn? Have folks who are engaged in your planning process, been involved in this development application at all?
Yeah, for sure. We have seen many of those folks come on the Planning and Zoning Commission. We've had 7 hours of public hearing so far. Many of those folks have come on, expressed support, submitted support letters. So that has been critically important.
That's great to hear. Beth, and I'm curious if you can talk about your experience, and specifically, I think it's interesting that in Bethel, you've been able to incorporate your affordable housing plan into your plan of conservation and development, and maybe sort of talk about how that is working, I guess, in Bethel, and what you've seen in terms of success or challenges, or both.
It's very interesting because we were fortunate. We did have another plan, a TOD plan, which was a transit-oriented development plan. And what we did with that was we took that, when you talk about meeting with stakeholders, we had developers and we had Bethel residents, and we spent a lot of time educating our residents that this was an opportunity to increase density a little bit and create affordable housing. Using all the premises that everyone says along public roadways, higher density areas, walkability, pedestrians, all those key phrases that planners use. And what we did was, in this instance, taking it to the next level with our POCD, is when you talk about affordable housing, again, as a planner, I refer to it a lot as 830G. We basically, what we did, and this is an innovative concept, I don't know what Fairfield has done this, is we eliminated the 30%. We went with 20%, and we said we worked with developers during the planning process to where it seemed to be more compatible with the developer themselves and the residential areas that were involved density-wise. We've had 3 projects since the adoption of our own regulations in 2018. Again, they're a combination of all of us working together. So by only having to provide 20% of the affordable component, all those other items that do come up for discussions during the approval process, such as architecture, concepts, all those things of how dense is it going to look, or working together to make improvements so everyone finds it acceptable and more in line with existing neighborhoods.
It's an interesting point, and thanks for making it, Beth, because I think, one thing we've talked a lot about in the Affordable Housing Guidebook is that, it's not, yes, obviously all of these conversations relate to 830G because that's the statute, that compels towns around affordable housing, but the idea being, and I'm hearing you saying it plays out this way, that if towns plan for affordable housing and tell developers what they want, then developers are much more likely to come in and give you what you want, right? And not find towns in the situation where you're in a more contentious development application kind of situation. And it sounds like that's what you're describing. Just to reiterate that if you lowered the requirements within your zoning to 20% and the town's working with the developer and telling you them that's what they want, then that's what you're getting. Folks are coming in and doing what you asked for. Is that an accurate kind of recap?
Yes, I would agree.
No, that's really great to hear. And Mark, I see you smiling. What is your experience in Fairfield with that? Because you've done a lot of proactive planning also. Are developers coming in and giving you what you want? Are you still finding a lot of contention? Is it a little both probably?
I wish. not entirely. Maybe we'll get the secret to Beth's sauce up there from Bethel.
No. 20 years of dealing with no.
But I do think, one of the things we did in our plan, I heard what Jocelyn was describing in Salisbury, we weren't, with the planning process, weren't focused as much on sites, which do tend to be contentious as more on tools. So we did have a series of action steps in our plan, including adopting an inclusionary zoning requirement townwide. It had previously been in our transit-oriented development overlay district, where we require 10% of the units to be set aside as affordable at 80% AMI. That's since been expanded townwide. So any development that results in a net increase of 10 or more dwelling units must set aside at least 10% of those. That's the minimum standard at affordable to persons at or below 80% of the area median income. We have adjusted our TOD overlay requirements upward because that's an area where we, like Bethel, provide for increased density. We're not quite at the 20%, but we're inching it upwards, so it's more than the 10% requirement. And then we did have some examples where folks would, because the inclusionary zoning requirement takes effect for developments more than 10 units, we had some 9-unit developments, surprisingly. So we do have an inclusionary zoning fee that applies to any new construction or building addition that goes into a dedicated housing trust fund. So that was another action step that was recommended as part of our affordable housing plan update. But to answer your question, it hasn't fully dissuaded folks from making applications for set-aside developments under 830G. We have had a number of very controversial, deeply contentious applications. We have several pending regarding projects under 830G. And I think really the issue for us is that we need to look at our underlying density, much like Bethel did, to provide for an alternative that makes sense, that can pencil out for developers in lieu of going through the 830G process. So that's something we're currently looking at right now.
Melissa, could I clarify something very quickly?
Yeah.
Just to note, I think, in Salisbury's affordable housing plan, we did point out specific locations where we wanted it to go. And just to clarify, that wasn't contentious when it was at the planning part. In the plan, it wasn't contentious. When you go to planning and zoning, that's when, you get the neighbors to come and express opposition. And, the interesting thing in our town is all of the people who expressed opposition to our specific project that has been in our plan for 2 years, first of all, said no one told them this project was, going to happen. And also, they said they aren't against affordable housing. They just don't think it should go here. And again, we're all experienced with that. We're not against it, just not here. But then that's on every site that you identify in the town. So I just wanted to clarify, I think if you can in your plan be specific about where it should go and get your stakeholders again on, to help you figure out where it should go and support those locations. That is really important, because again, the town leaders can also point to that and say, listen, we had a process, we invited you to participate in it. We had multiple forums where you could express input. We adopted this plan during a public hearing process. These locations were specifically called out. This is not a secret, and we need them all in order to meet our housing goals. So, again, whether we're able to get this specific project that we're working on now across the finish line or not, I just wanted to clarify that putting locations in the plan was not contentious. It's just that it's the next step in the process where you actually bring a real project to planning and zoning, where the contention has come up for us. But I think it makes a better plan if there is a way to say where it's going to go, not just what do we want, but where is it going to go? Because otherwise you can talk for 20 years about we need multifamily zoning, but if it's got to go somewhere. So
yeah, no, thanks for that point, that clarification. I think that's absolutely right on, Jocelyn, because it's hard enough. I mean, it's so hard once you get, a development application situation. So to have that conversation during the planning process, and something I didn't mention earlier, but when folks, take a look at the guidebook, that we've emphasized is if you can sort of start, take people through a process, through a conversation about, community values, like you just said, if we believe that we need to create more affordable housing and we want to, and get, people, kind of move people through the logic and the narrative, and then see if you can get them all the way to specific sites in the planning process. I think, that's excellent, because without that, you're not going to be able to create, all those points you just mentioned, the support for the elected officials and the planning and zoning commissioners who are going to have to make the decision to be able to point back and say, but you said that you wanted this, we agreed to it. Like, I think that is a really critical, line to draw. And also, I really was happy to hear at the beginning of the conversation that you said that folks were, writing letters of support, were engaging in those public hearings. And I don't know, how else you get people out to support if you haven't done a planning process. It's very difficult to get sort of random folks to come to a public hearing on a development application and say, yes, I love that, please build it. Unless there's some investment in that. And I think through the planning process, what you're describing, you can build that investment. And through a sustained affordable housing committee. I know you've talked about this a bunch, Mark, just having that, over time through the years, just a group of stakeholders locally who can continue to work and support the effort is a really important part of all this. So I want to pivot a little bit with my next question, and this is back to you, Jocelyn, and then I have kind of a related question for Mark and Beth, but just for folks who aren't as familiar with the different municipalities that you're representing, there's sort of different scales here. And Jocelyn, represents folks who are smaller towns, more rural areas in the state. And I'm just curious, Jocelyn, in terms of undertaking a planning process, it requires capacity, resources, leadership. How do you do that in a small town?
Yeah, I mean, our town, we have many small towns in Northwest Connecticut, 1,200 residents, for example, and no real professional planning staff. Many of our towns have very part-time zoning enforcement officers, and that is their land use department. So I guess I would the Northwest Hills COG are working with 9 towns and small towns in our region right now with grants from the Department of Housing to create affordable housing plans and help provide that professional planning facilitation of the process. So I would definitely encourage small towns and especially if you're all volunteer committees, to not try to do it all yourself, because it is a challenging process. And I think definitely try to either get a consulting land use planner or partner with your your council of governments to assist you through the process, again, to make sure that you're able to engage residents in the conversation, answer frequently asked questions about what is affordable housing, how is it financed, who's going to live there, all of those things. The smaller towns would benefit from having professional planning assistance in working through that process.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And Beth and Mark, Beth, starting with you, sort of, more of a middle-sized town, and you're the planning director, and you have some resources, but not sort of the full slate, I'm sure, of the folks that, you might have in a larger setting. What, in terms of this being a priority, right? Making planning for affordable housing a priority when you do have professional staff, but you have a lot of competing things. There's a lot of things on your agenda. Do you feel like people understand it's sort of the natural fit? Does it take convincing? Do you also, as Jocelyn just mentioned, bring in additional resources? How do you make it happen in a town like Bethel?
Well, in talking a little bit in regards to what Mark was saying before too, it goes up and it goes down. Bethel, when initially Bethel, it took years for Bethel to understand what affordable housing was, to see that it is just part of their community and take it and embrace it and recognize the fact that it's servicing a need that we have in order to maintain our vitality and our well-roundedness that we have available for anyone that lives here. And then it goes up and then it goes down with some contentious developments. And then you're put in the spot where you have to educate everyone all over again. So it's very, very difficult. It has its highs and its lows. As far as resources that we have used, we've been very fortunate that we have access to, for our POCD, our Plan of Conservation and Development, our TOD. So money and financing in doing this type of plan. I have always had the resources of a planning firm to help us in tackling some of these issues. Smaller towns don't, and that really is a problem. I know it's a little off subject too, but one thing that we're not quite there yet, but with the smaller towns especially, is dealing with the aspects of, okay, you have your affordable housing project. How do you do the enforcements pertaining to certifications on the financial qualifications of those that are living there? How do you keep track of doing all those type of things without having it be a cost to the town itself?
Those are excellent points also, Beth. And I guess I'm pitching this one to you, Mark. Do you think there's a role for, I know we don't have county governments in Connecticut, so maybe, a state role or more capacity at the local level to do, I think it's a great point you raised, Beth, that in terms of the implementation and creating the units and maintaining kind of, an eye on them, but sort of in the whole process, do you feel that you have enough support, if there's money coming in, say, through state programs or other funds like you mentioned, Beth, for planning? What other tools do we need, I guess is my question. Do you feel that if you're a larger government and you're pretty well staffed, you can handle it, or are there other things we really need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think even for larger communities, resources are always an issue. We have the benefit of having professional planning staff here in Fairfield, but as Beth mentioned, Jocelyn, the same, they're to the extent to which their staff is engaged with other things, taking applications, reviewing them, and doing the day-to-day business of the town. But typically for this, we've been fortunate to avail ourselves of grant opportunities. The most recent plan update we did was with funds from the Department of Housing through the Housing for Economic Growth program. And I know the state has a program now to assist communities doing planning work. I think, it's important to do that. We also use some planning grant funds to do a TOD study, much like Bethel. We looked at transit-oriented development opportunities around our two primary main service train stations. So again, all those things are critically important. And I think Beth brought up a good point, which is something we're struggling with here, is once we create the units, then there's an ongoing capacity issue or an obligation to monitor those units to ensure that they remain affordable. And traditionally that role has fallen to my department in support of the planning and zoning department. But it's as we add more units, it's becoming more and more burdensome. So we've looked at ways in which we might be able to tap the Housing Trust Fund, for example, to augment our own resources to do that type of work.
Could I just add a little bit to that, Melissa?
Please.
The Affordable Housing Trust Fund, Bethel has one too. And again, we've been trying to work with this for 20 years. And we did find that by using the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, we were able to hire someone that was able to keep up to speed with the qualifications and things like that. But again, thinking of Jocelyn and the smaller towns, those type of funds are not available to them unless you have the regulations in place to allow for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Some of our towns have they have housing trust funds that they have set up, a few of our small towns, and they use that. But I did want to ask Melissa, are you going to, I'm sure some of the people that are on this call are wondering when the guidebook is going to be out. I don't know if you're going to.
Thank you. And I meant to
the
bring that up.
final reveal of when
Well,
they get their hands on the guidebook.
Thank you, Beth. Sorry, Jocelyn, thank you. No, I meant to mention that at the beginning and I realized that I was going to tag it on at the end, but I'm happy to jump in with that now. So like I said, we initially had been on a more accelerated timeline and we're getting started right as COVID hit. And, you know, it's taken a little longer than we had hoped, but I can say with certainty that in the next 2 weeks, it will be out and available to everyone. And I'm really, really excited. We actually have a meeting with our advisory committee this afternoon to go over just sort of the final draft document, and then it is on its way, and look forward to sharing that with everyone. And I also wanted to add that if folks want to put some questions in the chat, we are ready to take questions from the audience. I have a long list and I can ask questions, Jocelyn, Mark, and Beth all day, but if folks want to ask questions, and I see one I have here. So have any of you seen cases where people opposed to affordable housing or a particular project changed their opinion? If so, what type of conversation and education seemed to help change their mind? Anybody want to take that one? It hasn't happened.
I'll say that a lot of times, certainly the case with the housing authority's development here in town, there was some concern amongst many of the neighbors, or at least some of the neighbors, with respect to what they were proposing at the time. Once it was built, they were pleasantly surprised, but getting through that process was a bit difficult. I think there were a couple situations where, you know, it was fairly muted in terms of the opposition. It was relegated to a neighbor or two that had some very specific concerns. In that case, it's pretty easy to have individualized conversations with them and work on strategies or things that you can do to alleviate those concerns. But we have some projects right now that where the entire neighborhood is in opposition virtually, so it's kind of difficult. And their comments are more general to some of the points that were raised by my fellow panelists. It's not that we're opposed to affordable housing, but you know, this project is out of character. It doesn't fit within the neighborhood, that type of thing. So I'm not sure. Some of those cases, it's not. I'm not sure you can overcome some of those issues.
Well, what I've heard from other communities too is you have to get the first project built and people have to be able to see, you know, how good it looks, that it didn't do all the things that they thought it was going to do. So I think that in a certain way, you know, getting through all the planning, getting to implementation, that is also one way where you see, you know, people kind of shift a little bit. Beth or Jocelyn, have you had any experience similar?
Can I just say in regards to those comments that, you know, everybody keeps saying affordable housing projects. And it doesn't, you know, when you give it that connotation, it sounds like a project or one project, affordable housing. There's so many other ways to incorporate an affordable component in any development that you do. You know, and I think that's getting lost in everyone's fears and concerns about affordability. Now, I say that now, but believe me, I have been where many of these towns have been before, just starting out, understanding what affordable housing is and so on and so forth. But when you take a component of affordability and you place it into a project, I think, Mark, you would agree in some of the projects that you've done, if you have an affordable component, it becomes part of the neighborhood. It doesn't have the stigma attached to it. You know, it is not a project. It is making affordability affordable within any development that you do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we've actually had one of our best examples of success is working with a nonprofit housing developer doing scattered site housing rehab, acquisition rehab. For all intents and purposes, these 2 and 3 family homes that provide much needed permanent supportive housing are very much the same as every other dwelling unit in that neighborhood. So for everyone else, it just appears as part of the neighborhood. So I do think it's important to look at different strategies, because that's one approach, a scattered site approach, where you're looking at 2 and 3 family, which we have a lot of here in town, but also to incorporate mixed income developments. So, you know, the inclusionary zoning requirement, for example, does provide for both market rate and affordable units within a private sector development.
Correct. I agree.
Can I just note, in my experience with contentious projects, of which every affordable housing development has its opponents, I don't usually focus on trying to change people's minds, because almost never have I seen that work. And again, instead, just focus on bringing supporters to the conversation and supporters to the table. And just going back to, I think, the planning process and the community meetings and the getting people to understand the need and the strategies and how you'll meet that need, gets those supporters to come to the table. Because again, especially right now in the polarized conversations that are happening, it's very difficult to change anyone's mind. And so I mainly focus on, let's make sure that we're building support for the need, for the solutions, and really energizing those people to speak up when there's a specific opportunity being discussed at a planning and zoning commission meeting.
I think that's an excellent comment, Jocelyn. Thanks for reiterating it, because I think, you know, absolutely right. It's that coalition of supporters and people who, you know, just getting people engaged. Just, you know, it's one thing to come out in opposition, but just to build over time a base of people who will be there, you know, when you need them to come to a public meeting to say, you know, yes, we all talked about this, we agree this is important for us. I think, you know, that is really how you shift things and change the narrative over the long run. And you all know, as planners in economic development folks, this is, you know, it's long range, hard work on the ground. But it, you know, I am encouraged just hearing you guys talk about it today. You know, I think if we had this conversation even 3 or 4 years ago, we would have been a lot more hurt or a lot more frustration. I do hear progress, and I think that's good to hear, obviously. So another question from the chat: do changes in local political leadership over time create challenges for creating plans and ensuring that those plans have continuity, staying power? So you guys have all been in your roles for a long time. You've seen a lot of elected officials come and go, I'm sure. You know, who wants to take that one? Any volunteers? I'm looking at Mark because I know he has a new mayor, but you know, other folks too.
Well, I think Beth touched on it earlier. You go through peaks and valleys in terms of the level of support for affordable housing within each community. There was, with the creation of Affordable Housing Committee in Fairfield back in the late 1980s, there's a lot of support for it. And our first select woman at the time was instrumental in providing key leadership, both in the formation of the Affordable Housing Committee itself and then advocating for specific projects. And then we went through a period of time where it wasn't as high a priority. And so it's now back in the forefront again, partly because of 830G applications, but two, the Affordable Housing Committee has been very active in pushing this. So I think that's just natural that you're going to go through that cycle, and you have to take advantage of the opportunities that do present themselves. But it's part of the nature of the course here.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another question here. It's a little, it's related. It's not completely on topic, but I'll throw it out and just see what folks think. So the question is on fair share, and in planning for affordable housing. Is that something that you all have thought about in your towns? Considered including in your planning? I know it's part of the conversation, but not sort of squarely in it at this moment in Connecticut. So anybody want to talk about fair share?
Well, I'll just say I did go to the session that was, I think, right before this session on the fair share plan that is it Open Communities
Alliance. Yeah.
Alliance has just put out, and my initial impressions, although I haven't had a chance to read the whole plan, is that it's a great discussion point to bring to these housing plan processes in terms of, again, this is a statewide need, it's a statewide problem. How does each town take on its responsibility to address the need? So I think it's a great point of discussion, as is 830G. I mean, 830G makes us all talk about it, and it's valuable in that way. So I would say that the fair share study and concept really makes sense to talk about as part of the housing plan, a town housing plan planning process. That's my opinion.
Yeah, no, and I'll add, you hear a lot of, conversation about just where affordable housing exists today and where it ought to exist. And I do think, incorporating a fair share conversation into that broader landscape is important. And the concept, that we really emphasize in the guidebook is affordability in every community, that there are affordable options, for everyone, everywhere, kind of going back to that nice, kind of dreamy picture that I showed at the beginning, that, there should be affordability everywhere and not just in some places. And I think fair share absolutely is, is a way to get at that. I have another question for you all. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I was, wondering sort of the age-old planner's question, how you make sure the plan doesn't sit on a shelf, right? I mean, obviously you're reacting to applications as they come in, and that's one aspect of it, but, your plan is a lot more than that. You have goals that you set for yourselves. There are actions, that folks within the government and, maybe nonprofit organizations or other actors play a role. So how do you create a plan that is active, that, you don't sort of work really hard on and then kind of wait until there's a development application and then kind of bring it back out again? Or maybe that is, the way it is most effectively used, but sort of curious on that point.
Go ahead, Beth.
It's very difficult to explain, but as far as I'm concerned, is you make it doable. You don't set your goals so high that you can't achieve, or at least achieve it by baby steps. In dealing with, I keep looking at Jocelyn because I think the small towns are an excellent example of trying to accomplish affordable housing in some of our rural areas and stuff. But just even taking the simplest principle of what some of us larger towns just take for granted, accessory apartments. That's a very smooth way of introducing affordability into a small town. But when you're dealing with the larger towns, I think that we're just beyond that level of having a plan sit on the shelf because of our experiences with some of the aspects of affordable housing. And I'll be honest with you, they've been negative aspects. Makes you work harder on your plan and make it more of a positive effect on a town, and you want to implement it. I want to show that my town is a very well-rounded town, and it's part of our diversity and vitality. And that's why we are in COVID and everything else. That's why we're surviving. That's why Fairfield's surviving. Fairfield is surviving because of the improvements, and I've looked to Fairfield for a lot of the diversity and economic development that we are having here in Bethel, which is much smaller than Fairfield. You learn from your other planners and from your own experiences, basically.
Can I'd like to just note and answer quickly, and then, sorry, Mark.
No, it's okay.
Our small towns have accessory apartments. We've had accessory apartment zoning forever. Again, it's a tool in the toolkit, but it is not the answer to providing housing opportunity. So anyway, that's another conversation, but our small towns have that. And our small towns have been talking about the need for affordable housing ever since they can remember, I can remember.
I wasn't implying that you didn't have something. I was just trying to say, use as an example, as a small example of if a small town isn't doing this, it's an opportunity to improve it, show them what affordability is.
Yeah.
On a very, very small scale.
I just worry I worry about small towns thinking if they do accessory apartments, then that's enough.
No.
But anyway, but I just, in terms of plans sitting on shelves, all I wanted to say was, again, hearkening back to the process, super important to bring in our small towns, it's nonprofit, local affordable housing organizations. They have to be part of the process. They have to be part of the solution. And bigger towns is probably developers, private developers, but bringing the people who are going to actually, the zoning commission, making sure that they're all at the table and that they agree to the things that are in the plan, that they are going to pursue them before you adopt it.
Excellent, thank you. And I see that partnership has the poll that they'd like folks to fill out that just popped up. So I'll just note that. And I have one more question. I think we have 2 minutes left. So like a really quick lightning round just to end it here. If there was one thing you could do to make it easier to develop affordable housing in Connecticut, what would it be? One thing. And it could be related to the plan or it could be something totally different, but just throw that one out there for you. If anybody wants to take that.
Easier to plan or easier to develop?
Well, I guess ultimately my thinking is the planning process makes it easier to develop. So I guess it could be any tool, but since this was about planning, maybe more towards planning.
Well, I'll just chime in on the last question before we turn to that, give up my fellow panelists more opportunity to come up with their answers.
Thanks, Mark.
I would say, I would agree with Beth's and Jocelyn's points. Beth, it definitely has to be, the goals have to be attainable. And I do think that the plan that we developed was less of a tone, but more focused on specific action steps that could be implemented within a reasonable time period. And there were groups that were assigned the responsibility of taking the lead on each of those action steps and a timeline associated with each of them, which we don't always meet in terms of the deadline or the goal, but it was there as a checkpoint. I think also in Fairfield, the Affordable Housing Committee is established by ordinance and has an obligation to report annually to the legislative body on annual progress. And that provides a natural point in which we have to report back to the town leadership as to what we've done the last year, specifically to address the action steps outlined in the plan. So I do think both of those things are important to provide for some key accountability. And so now I'll kick it back to Jocelyn, who has the answer to that last question.
The answer is money.
I agree with that.
I think the affordable housing plan grants the Department of Housing has now are terrific. They're needed, again, as in all of our towns, to just help us bring the resources to the table. And then we're going to need bond funding to construct these units. We have a ton of demand for our small towns are creating projects that are in the pipeline that are ready to go, but they need construction financing. So we need to continue to have bond money available for these nonprofits and others who are building and constructing these units. That's my easy answer.
Well, thank you for your easy answer, Jocelyn. I see we're at time. I see Sean back on our screen, and I don't want to run into the next panel because I know partnership has a whole day-long panel sessions for us to all participate in. So Sean, back to you, and thank you to all of you on the panel for taking the time and for this great conversation today.
Thank you all, and everyone, please join sessions, the remaining sessions of today and for the rest of the week. And thank you, panelists. This is really informative, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.